The briefing lasted 9 minutes. That was the first sign it was going to go wrong. 9 minutes for a target we'd been watching for 3 weeks. 9 minutes for a relay station that had been operational for 11 years and had, in that time, dropped every sapient being who'd walked through its field range without clearance. Every soldier, every refugee, every surveyor, every Velhari diplomat foolish enough to cut through the reach without checking the pulse schedule. 11 years of confirmed drops, hundreds of documented incidents. And we got 9 minutes of briefing on how we were going to walk inside, pull the manifest data from the lower corridor access panels, and walk back out before the next pulse window. I didn't say anything in that briefing. I was infantry, not signals. My job was to move when they told me to move, hold what they told me to hold, and not express opinions about timelines in rooms full of people with more rank than sense. That is the social contract of attached infantry on a specialist operation, and I had signed it without reading the fine print the first time I put on a sweep kit and learned what the word attached actually meant in operational practice, which is, you are here because the people who designed this mission needed a body that could carry things and follow instructions, and the instructions do not include a request for your assessment of the timeline. But I counted the numbers in my head on the way to the transport. 11 years. Cycle interval of approximately 42 minutes between pulse emissions, based on the signal's intelligence we'd been handed. The previous confirmed pulse had fired at 0614. We were inserting at 0731. That gave us, by the math, somewhere between 7 and 15 minutes of clear corridor time before the next window, depending on whether the signals team's cycle estimate was accurate to the minute or whether it was accurate to the decade, which, given the state of our technical intelligence on Vethani systems at that point in the war, was a more reasonable question than anyone in that briefing room seemed to want to ask. The Vethani compliance network had been in operation for a long time before we understood what it was. The early intelligence assessments, from the first 2 years of contact, had classified the relay stations as standard communication infrastructure, elevated broadcast towers with an unusual power draw, and an irregular emission schedule that nobody had mapped against incident data at the time, because at the time, nobody was tracking the incident data in a systematic way. The Velhari had been dealing with the compliance pulse for decades before they told us about it, which they hadn't done out of malice, but out of the particular kind of strategic embarrassment that comes from admitting that a significant fraction of your military and diplomatic losses in a given region can be attributed to a system you didn't identify as a weapon until years after it was deployed against you. The first human operator to encounter a live pulse was a civilian logistics coordinator named Breskin, who had been hired to help route supply convoys through the Reach during the early period of the joint operation. He walked into a Vethani-adjacent supply depot during a scheduled administrative inspection, and the mobile pulse unit positioned at the depot entrance fired, and he kept walking, and the 4 Velhari soldiers who had accompanied him as escorts went down in the doorway, and Breskin, by his own account, didn't notice for about 90 seconds. Because he had his head down reviewing a manifest, and his body had simply filtered the frequency the way his body filtered everything else in the electromagnetic landscape of an active supply depot, which is to say, without acknowledgement. The report he filed was meticulous. The intelligence cell that received it spent 3 weeks arguing about whether the human immunity was real or whether Breskin had simply gotten lucky with a partial pulse. Then they ran a controlled trial with 4 human volunteers and a mobile unit, and after that they stopped arguing. I kept those thoughts to myself on the transport. I watched the dawn come up through the viewport, hard and pale over the Reach, the sky the particular color of early morning in a cold country that doesn't have enough distance from the horizon to warm up properly before the light arrives. The relay station was visible from 20 kilometers out on a clear day, and the day was clear. I could see the pulse nodes on the roof, small at that distance, their oxidized housings dark against the pale sky, arranged in their cluster of 6. Somebody had built those things to last. 11 years of continuous operation in a climate that wasn't kind to exposed infrastructure, and they were still running. You had to give the Vethani credit for that, if not for much else. I thought about Sin Oreth. I'd never met her. She was Resistance, one of the Velhari cells that had been running supply lines through the outer stations before the Vethani pushed the cordon east, cutting off 3 of the 4 main transit routes, and forcing the Resistance supply network into the kind of improvised rerouting that eats operational capacity, the way a slow leak eats a fuel reservoir. Her name had come up in the pre-mission packet as a secondary item, almost a footnote. The previous team to enter Keshev Station, a signals unit, not infantry, in through the maintenance corridor 4 months back, had reported grease pencil markings on several of the lower relay panels. Informal notation. Unknown origin. The signals team had photographed them and moved on. The intelligence cell had run the handwriting against the Resistance registry and matched it to Orath, a relay technician who had been operating inside the Vethani Reach for about 8 months before she was taken. I want to explain what I mean when I say she was taken, because the word covers a lot of ground and the ground under it matters. The Vethani approach to Resistance operatives was not primarily punitive. Or rather, it was punitive in the way that all systematic enforcement is punitive, but the primary operational interest was informational. They wanted to know who she'd been in contact with, what she knew about the Resistance's internal communications architecture, what nodes she'd accessed, and when, and what she'd transmitted through them. They were very good at extracting that kind of information. The Resistance knew they were good at it, which was why they operated on strict compartmentalization protocols. Nobody knew more than they needed to know for their specific function, and the specific function design meant that losing a single operator, even a technically skilled one with 8 months inside the Reach, cost the network a bounded amount. Whether that bounded amount was small enough to be operationally acceptable was a question that the Resistance commanders wrestled with, and that I was not in a position to second-guess. What I knew, sitting in the transport watching the relay station grow larger through the viewport, was that she had been inside Corridor D 4 months ago with a grease pencil and a panel she'd gotten open, and she had written something on the back face of that panel. The signals team's photo was blurry, a handheld shot taken fast, in low light, at an angle that suggested someone who knew they needed the image but wasn't certain they had time to take it properly. You could see there was writing. You could see it was small and careful. You couldn't read what it said. My job in Corridor D was to pull the access panel manifest data from the relay node interfaces, alphanumeric strings that identified each node's broadcast parameters, frequencies, cycle timing offsets, power draw profiles. The signals team needed them to model the pulse geometry of the station's network, because the Vethani had started varying their compliance pulse configurations between stations and the old models weren't reliable anymore. It was a documentation task. The kind of work that requires care and method and very little initiative. The kind of thing you give to the soldier who doesn't argue in briefings. I didn't argue. I got on the transport and I watched the dawn. We hit the station at 07:34, which was 3 minutes later than planned due to a sensor suppression package that needed to be reloaded twice before it would run. I noted the time and added it to my count. Everything in an operation that runs late runs slightly later than the late amount, because the time lost at the beginning creates pressure at every subsequent decision point, and pressure creates small inefficiencies, and small inefficiencies are how windows become problems. The approach across open ground took 4 minutes. The Reach in the early morning was the kind of landscape that doesn't cooperate with the word empty. It was full of things. It was just that the things were the same in every direction. A flat expanse of pale mineral soil with the occasional low growth that the local biology had decided was sufficient and hadn't revised in what looked like a very long time. The relay station sat on a shallow rise at the center of about 3 kilometers of clear sightline in every direction. The Vethani had chosen the location deliberately. The compliance pulse propagated most efficiently from elevated positions with unobstructed radius, and 3 kilometers of clear ground around the node cluster meant 3 kilometers of guaranteed coverage. The station itself was almost incidental. It was a housing for the nodes, a maintenance facility for the systems that kept the nodes running, and not much more. We moved across the open ground in the configuration. The signals team had specified spread formation, low sightline, time to the rotation of the external sensor coverage. I was carrying the documentation unit, the extraction kit, and my standard sweep equipment, which totaled approximately 18 kilograms in addition to my own weight, and the mineral soil gave underfoot in a way that was not quite soft enough to absorb the impact of a loaded step, but just soft enough to be inefficient. By the time we reached the northern axis, I was warm in the way that has nothing to do with ambient temperature, the warmth that's purely mechanical, the body doing work. The exterior of Keshev Station was what you'd expect from 11 years of continuous Vethani operation and zero maintenance investment. The cladding on the eastern face was delaminating in sheets, each layer a different shade of gray-brown, like sediment in a cut bank. The oldest layer darkest at the bottom, the most recent paler and still carrying the ghost of whatever finish had been applied when the building was new. The pulse nodes on the roof were the exception, clean, well-maintained, their housings showing none of the oxidization that had claimed everything else. Whatever the Vethani's feelings about the rest of the structure, the nodes mattered. The rest of the building was infrastructure. The nodes were the point. We came in through the northern access, a service door that our signals team had tagged as unmonitored, which it was, in the sense that there were no active sensors on the door itself. There were sensors on the corridor behind it, but those had been suppressed as part of the package running since 0650. 17 minutes of clean corridor was what we'd bought with the suppression package. At 0734, we had 13 minutes remaining. I want to be precise about the unit I went in with, because it matters later. Sergeant Veth was running the sweep, an infantry lifer with 14 years in the Eastern operations, the kind of person who has filed the edges off every unnecessary movement until what remains is pure economy. He moved through corridors the way water moves through a pipe, not fast in any dramatic sense, but continuous, with no waste. 2 Velhari support specialists, Orev and a second one whose name I kept losing because I am bad with new names under operational load, and she was new to the unit, 3 days on. Me. That was the team. The Velhari specialists were experienced in relay station sweeps. They knew the panel systems, the data interfaces, the Vethani access protocols. They were the reason we were here at all, operationally speaking. The human contribution to the team was my documentation skills, my compliance pulse immunity, and my ability to carry things. The immunity was logged in my file as a field asset, but it had never actually been relevant to an operation in the direct sense. Previous compliance pulse incidents had been incidental, outside target areas, situations where the pulse fired, and I noticed because the people around me went down. This was the first time I had gone into a location where the pulse was the known variable and my immunity was the working assumption. Nobody said that out loud in the briefing. It was implicit in the assignment structure, and everybody in the room understood it, and nobody chose to name it because naming it would have required someone to say, "We are assigning a human to this corridor partly because, if the timing is wrong, they will be the one still standing." That is a true statement. And it is the kind of true statement that briefing rooms prefer to leave in the air between the lines rather than commit to the record. I went in anyway. The data was the mission, and the data was what we were there for, and the fact that I happened to be built in a way that made me useful for this particular situation was a fact about me the same way the shape of my hands is a fact about me, something I'd inherited without negotiating and lived with without much attention. Corridor D was the fourth and deepest section of the lower relay level. The upper level was administrative, offices, storage, the kind of space that accretes around any functional installation over time, filling with the detritus of operation. The lower level was functional. The relay nodes themselves, their access panels, the cable runs and power conduit and environmental management systems that kept them operational. It smelled of metal and of the particular mineral quality that Vethani climate systems produce, which is not unpleasant but is immediately recognizable once you've encountered it, like the smell of a specific kind of machine that you'll remember forever after. The first two corridors, A and B, were wide, well maintained by the standards of everything else in the station, and clear. Whatever the Vethani invested in this facility, they invested it in the corridors their own personnel used regularly. The cable runs were dressed neatly against the walls, secured at regular intervals, color-coded in a system I didn't know how to read but that clearly had a logic. The overhead lighting was functional. The environmental management was running at a temperature colder than comfortable for a human in sweep kit, which probably indicated the optimal range for Vethani physiognomy, and the Vethani's complete indifference to anyone else's preferences. Corridor C was narrower and less maintained. The cable dressing was older, and some of the securing brackets had pulled from the wall, leaving cables draped in loose festoons above head height. The lighting was down to approximately 2/3 in two of the three sections, the dead panels open and dark. It serviced the secondary relay systems, the administrative and communication nodes, as distinct from the compliance pulse primaries, and the secondary systems had received the secondary level of attention. Functional but uncared for, a corridor that got visited when something broke and not much otherwise. Corridor D was at the end of a junction from C. Through a door that required the access code, the signals team had pulled from Vethani administrative intercepts approximately a week prior, and that, mercifully, had not been rotated. Veth ran it in 6 seconds. The door opened. The corridor was approximately 60 meters long and about 1.5 meters wide, narrow enough to make you aware of the walls in a way that wider corridors don't. The relay nodes were mounted at intervals on both walls, their access panels at chest height. The cable runs behind them thicker and more complex than anything above. The compliance pulse primaries. 6 nodes on each wall, 12 total, paired to the 6 physical pulse array housings on the roof in an architecture the signals team needed to map. Understanding the pairing was the reason for the data pull. The floor was the same composite as the rest of the lower level, a light gray that showed scuff marks clearly, in a pattern that indicated exactly which path the maintenance personnel walked when they serviced the corridor. Not the center. The left side, close to the wall where the panels were. The path of someone who made this walk regularly and had their route. I walked the right side. I don't know why entirely. Possibly because it wasn't the path. Possibly because a different line gives a different angle on the panels, and I was, by training, a documentation person who looked for angles. Panel 1 was at the entrance to Corridor D, mounted at chest height on the left wall. Veth pulled it, ran the interface, extracted the data in 40 seconds. Clean. Panel 2 was 6 meters further in, same configuration, same process. Panel 3 was at a junction, mounted lower, knee height, which meant crouching, which I noted because crouching is slower to get out of than standing and slower matters in corridors with pulse windows. We were at 11 minutes, elapsed from suppression package start, when we reached position 4. I want to account for those 11 minutes carefully, because they are the 11 minutes that contain the whole of what happened before the pulse, and the whole of what led up to it, and the accounting matters to me in a way that it wouldn't if the outcome had been different. 11 minutes from package start, 4 minutes remaining in the suppression window, 4 panels to pull, 3 complete, 1 remaining. Veth had said we'd move faster than estimated. We had moved exactly at the estimated speed, possibly fractionally faster, and we were still running short. The panel at position 4 was standard Vethani relay access. Rectangular face, approximately 60 centimeters by 40, mounted flush to the corridor wall at chest height, recessed handle at the right edge. Gray composite housing, the same oxidized finish as everything else in the station. A serial plate on the face with the node identifier in stamped characters, a Vethani alphanumeric that I'd been logging all day. I photographed the front face, logged the identifier, then reached past Veth and took the recessed handle and pulled. The panel came away on its hinges and swung toward me, and I held it at an angle to keep it from falling, and that's when I saw the back face. The grease pencil note was in the upper right corner of the back face, written in small, careful characters. Not rushed, not cramped. The kind of handwriting you see from someone who is used to writing in difficult conditions, where you don't have a flat surface and you don't have adequate light and you may not have much time, and who has learned through practice to make each character count anyway. Not the handwriting of urgency. The handwriting of discipline. 6 words and a designation. Meridian 4 still active, 211 Delta. I read it once, then I read it again. I have thought a great deal since then about what I was thinking in that specific moment, the second or two between the first reading and the second, and the honest answer is that I wasn't thinking in any organized sense. My mind did not produce a coherent analysis of what the notation meant, or why it was there, or who had written it, and under what circumstances. What it produced was something much more immediate than analysis. The recognition that someone had been here before me, in this specific spot, holding this specific panel, and had decided that what they knew was worth writing down. That recognition happened in the body before it happened in the mind. Something quiet and certain, the way cold hits you before you've identified the temperature. I was still holding the panel at that angle, reading the note for the second time, when the pulse fired. I want to describe what it looked like from the outside, because from the inside I experienced nothing. One moment the corridor was a corridor, Veth 3 meters ahead of me, working the data interface on the open panel face. The 2 Velhari specialists behind me, Orev logging the sweep, the other one managing the documentation pack. The low ambient hum of the relay station's power systems giving the air its specific texture. The next moment, without transition, without any audible or visible signal I could detect, all of that changed. Veth went down, not fell went down. There is a distinction, and it is not a small one. A fall involves a process, a loss of balance, a grab for something, a stumble, the body's automatic systems trying to reassert equilibrium. What happened to Veth was not a fall. It was a transition from standing to kneeling that bypassed every intermediate stage, as if the decision to kneel had been made somewhere far above the level of his body's awareness of what was happening, and his body had simply complied. He was on his knees with his hands flat on the corridor floor, and his equipment settled around him before I had fully registered the movement. Behind me, I heard the 2 Velhari specialists go down, 2 sets of knee impacts, almost simultaneous, close enough together that they sounded like one event. The sound of their equipment settling, then quiet. I was still holding the panel. The corridor was very quiet. The relay systems kept running. The hum didn't change. Whatever the pulse did to the biological systems in range, it didn't interrupt the station's electronics, only the organisms. The station had no opinion about what had happened. It continued doing exactly what it had been doing. I stood there for what might have been 5 seconds, maybe 8, just standing, holding the panel, looking at the 3 people on the floor, looking at the way their positions had arranged themselves, Veth with his hands flat, squared and deliberate even in the drop, Orev with his head turned toward me, the 3rd specialist with her equipment pack half open where her hand had let it go. And then I looked at Veth's face. I have thought about this many times since. The medical briefings had covered the physiology of compliance pulse suppression in some detail, the neural oscillation interference, the disruption of intentional motor function, the preservation of sensory and cognitive awareness. They had described it accurately, as far as I could tell. What they had not prepared me for was what that looked like in a person's face when you were standing in front of them. His face was not frightened. It was not in pain. It was not the face of someone who had been hurt or who had lost consciousness or who was confused about what had happened. It was fully, completely present. His eyes were tracking. He was watching me. He knew exactly where he was and exactly what had happened and exactly what it meant, and he could not do anything about any of it, and his face showed none of that struggle, because the struggle was somewhere the face doesn't reach. Somewhere behind the eyes, inside the machinery of intention and will, where there was now simply absence, where there had been a decision-making self and now there was watching. It was the most quietly terrible thing I'd ever seen. I looked back at the panel in my hands. Meridian 4 still active, 211 Delta. I thought, she wrote this knowing this might happen. She wrote this knowing that the pulse might fire while the next person was holding this panel, and that the next person might be standing in a corridor with people on the floor, and that the next person would need to know. I thought she wrote this for me, not for me specifically, but for whoever was standing where I was standing, for the one who was still standing. Then I stopped thinking and started working, because there were approximately 34 minutes until the next pulse window, and 3 people on the floor who needed to be upright and functional and out of this corridor before that. And I was the only person in corridor D currently capable of deciding what to do next. I set the panel back into its housing. I didn't close it. I photographed the grease pencil note with the documentation unit, 2 shots, different angles, making sure both the text and the serial plate on the front face were identifiable in the same sequence of images. I logged it with a timestamp and a position marker. Then I pulled the data interface from the panel face and inserted the extraction unit and waited the 40 seconds for the data pull to complete. I want to be honest about the state I was in during those 40 seconds. My hands were steady, that's training, not temperament. Hands stay steady when they're occupied with a defined task, and I gave them a defined task, but the inside of my head was running at a speed that had very little to do with the interface in front of me. I was doing the geometry. Distance from position 4 to the northern access, approximately 40 meters, in a corridor that was 1.5 meters wide with cable runs along one wall. Time available, 34 minutes, less whatever it had already been since the pulse, which I estimated at 3 minutes by then. 3 adults in full sweep kit, none of whom could walk. I could not carry them. I could drag them on the composite floor, using the equipment harnesses in stages. The math was close, but it was workable if I moved consistently and didn't stop to calculate. The extraction unit beeped. Data pull complete. I put it in my kit. Then I went to Veth. I crouched in front of him at his level, and I looked at his face from close enough to be sure he was tracking me. He was. Whatever the pulse had taken, it hadn't taken his attention. "I've got the data," I said. "All 4 panels. I'm going to move you to the access door. It'll be slow. I'm going to use your chest harness." He couldn't respond. His eyes moved the smallest shift, the only thing available to him, and I took it as acknowledgement, or I chose to take it as acknowledgement, which is not the same thing but was what the situation made available. I got him by the chest harness and started moving. I want to say something about the work of moving an adult human in full kit across 40 meters of corridor floor. Because it is not a dramatic act in any cinematic sense, and it took the better part of 12 minutes, and almost all of those 12 minutes were occupied not by thought or analysis, but by the purely physical problem of sustaining traction on a composite floor with a load that outweighed me by about 15 kilograms. The harness held. The floor was smooth. I moved in stages, 3 meters, checked the corridor ahead and behind 3 meters. Counting breaths rather than steps, because counting steps would have given me a number I didn't want to have to track. I want to be specific about what thinking looks like when your body is occupied with a load. It is not the organized, sequential thinking of a person sitting at a table. It is more like listening to 2 conversations at once, where one conversation is entirely physical. The pull of the harness, the quality of the floor, the distance remaining, the status of the corridor ahead and behind, and the other is whatever the mind does with material it hasn't finished processing. Both conversations run simultaneously and neither fully commands the other. You are not distracted from the physical work. You are inside it and also inside something else, and the two coexist without resolving. The thing the second conversation kept returning to was the pulse itself. Not as a tactical problem, I was past the tactical problem by then. The tactical problem had a solution and the solution was in progress, but as an experience, or as a non-experience which is closer to the truth of it. I had been inside a compliance pulse event 3 times by that point, including the 2 prior incidents, and all 3 times the defining characteristic had been the same: nothing. Not resistance, not struggle, not a sensation of force absorbed or withstood. Nothing. A frequency had been present and my nervous system had not noticed it, the way you don't notice the temperature of a room you've been in for an hour, the way your eyes stop processing the texture of a ceiling you've looked at every morning for years. The Velhari on the floor had noticed it. They had noticed it entirely, inescapably, with no buffer between the signal and the response. I had 35 years of human industrial civilization running as background noise in my nervous system, and they had whatever evolutionary history the Velhari carried, which had apparently not included the specific electromagnetic environment that produced the immunity. Not a better history, not a worse one. Just a different one, arriving at a different filtering profile, in a frequency range where it turned out to matter. 3 meters, check, 3 meters. I want to note, for the record, that Veth did not make this harder than it needed to be. I don't know the precise mechanics of how much voluntary muscle control persists under compliance suppression. The briefings were ambiguous on the point, citing individual variation and the complexity of distinguishing intentional from reflexive movement in a state where the suppression specifically targets intentionality. But Veth moved with attraction rather than against it in a way that I noticed, and that made a material difference. Whether that was residual voluntary cooperation, or reflex, or the particular physics of a body that is very well trained and defaults to efficient positions even in the absence of instruction, I couldn't tell. It helped. I got him to the access door, propped against the wall with his back straight and his equipment cleared to the side, and I went back for the second specialist. The second one was Orev, and Orev was lighter, and I moved him faster. I was also better at it by then. I'd learned the rhythm of the work on the first run, which is how most physical skills work, and the second run had the benefit of that learning. He was facing me when I reached him, and his eyes tracked me from the moment I came into his sightline, and there was something in his expression that I recognized without being able to name it at the time. Not gratitude, that wasn't the right word, or not all of it. Something more like a careful attention, the look of a person who is nodding a thing precisely. I moved him to the door and went back for the third specialist. Her name was Deven, which I had known when I reviewed the unit roster and lost somewhere in the operational load of the morning, and which came back to me at the moment I reached her. I don't know why that specific moment, but there it was. Deven. I got her harness. I started moving, and she was the lightest of the 3 and I was the most practiced by then, and I had her at the access door in 7 minutes. 40 meters of corridor, 3 adults, 19 minutes from the pulse by my count when I settled the last of them against the wall and checked all 3 faces in sequence, tracking, present, waiting. 15 minutes until the next pulse window, estimated. I sat down on the floor across from them, back against the opposite wall, and I breathed for a moment. The documentary unit was in my kit, and the data was in the documentary unit, and the work was done. And now the work was waiting, which is a different kind of work and one I had always found harder. Action is easy in the sense that it occupies the body and leaves the mind with a defined problem to address. Waiting gives the mind nothing to address except itself, which is where the difficulty lives. I looked at the 3 of them across the corridor. Veth with his hands settled flat on his knees, the absolute tidiness of a man who cannot decide to be different but still finds himself arranged. Orev with his eyes on me, steady and specific. Devin with her equipment pack receded against her hip, which I hadn't done, which meant she'd been able to do something. Some minimal motor act that didn't rise to the level of intention the pulse was suppressing, or which rose to it just enough. I thought they're still in there. Not a profound thought. Everybody knew that, technically, and the briefings had covered it, and the physiology was documented. But there is a difference between knowing a fact and knowing it in the particular way you know it when you are sitting across from three people and watching their eyes move and understanding that the stillness is not absence. I talked to them. I told them about the note. I told them what it said Meridian 4, still active, 211 Delta, and that it was in small, careful handwriting, and that I documented it and it was in my kit. I told them who I thought had written it and what I understood about who she was. I didn't know if that was useful. It gave me something to do with the waiting, and it seemed to me that being in a room where something was being said was better than being in a room where nothing was, even if you couldn't respond to it, and possibly especially then. I told them about the signals team's analysis of the earlier photographs, what little I knew of it, that the handwriting matched a resistance technician who had been in the station 4 months ago, that she'd been operating inside the Reach for 8 months before she was taken. I told them that I didn't know what the notation meant specifically, not yet, but that it was clearly operational rather than personal, clearly something she'd wanted the next person in that corridor to know. I noticed, partway through, that I was explaining the note to 3 people who were in no position to comment on it, in a corridor in a Vethani relay station, while sitting on the floor with my back against a wall waiting for a second pulse event. If I had been describing this scene to myself beforehand, I would have said that it would feel strange. It didn't feel strange. It felt like the correct use of the time. At 41 minutes and some seconds from the first pulse, the second pulse fired. I felt nothing. The hum of the relay systems continued. The 3 people across from me were already on the floor. The second pulse found nothing new to take. 11 minutes after that, Veth stood up. He stood the way you stand after a very long time in a difficult position, carefully, testing weight, one hand on the wall. He stood still for a moment, just breathing. His equipment was still arranged the way I'd left it. He looked at me, and then he looked at the 3 of them in the access corridor, and then he looked at me again. All 4 panels, I said, data's clean. He nodded once. Orev's got the egress route. We move in 3. That was the whole of it. We were out of the station by 0920 and back across the line by 1047. The data pull was clean on all 4 panels. The signals team was satisfied. The debrief was thorough and professionally conducted and covered, in precise technical language, the adjusted timeline, the suppression package shortfall, the recovery procedure, and the data extraction outcome. It touched on almost none of what had happened in Corridor D in the way that actually mattered, because debrief language is designed to describe outcomes and procedures. And outcomes and procedures are not the same as what happens to a person's face in a corridor when the thing they cannot resist comes for them and takes what it takes. I filed my documentation. I submitted the photographs of all 4 panels, including the 2 shots of the grease pencil note, with the time stamp and position marker, and a flag indicating that the notation appeared to match prior resistance documentation from the same location, and should be forwarded to the intelligence cell for analysis. Then I found a quiet room and sat in it. I have spent time thinking about what I want to say about the period that followed the Keshev operation, and the honest answer is that I am not entirely sure how to say it in a way that doesn't sound like something it isn't. I am not a reflective person by nature. I'm a person who solves defined problems with available tools and then moves to the next defined problem. And most of what I do in a given day is exactly that. And the days are full, and the work is real, and I have not had much occasion to spend time in quiet rooms examining the texture of my own reactions. The quiet room after Keshiev was unusual in that regard. What I kept coming back to was the note. Not the data, not the pulse, not the particular mechanics of moving 3 adults across 40 meters of corridor floor. The note, 6 words and a number in small, careful handwriting on the back of a relay panel that had been open 4 months ago in the hands of someone who might not come back. The intelligence cell's analysis came back 14 days later. Meridian 4 turned out to be the Resistance's informal designation for the Keshiev relay node's secondary broadcast channel, a lower-power administrative transmission line that the Vethani used for internal coordination traffic, distinct from the compliance pulse system and less heavily monitored. The Resistance had identified a consistent blind spot in the Vethani's monitoring protocol for that channel, a timing offset in the scan cycle, something in the architecture of how the system handled low-priority administrative traffic, and had been piggybacking covert signals on the administrative traffic through that offset for 8 months. 211 Delta was a cycle reference, the 211th operational cycle of the channel's covert use within the Resistance's internal numbering system. I want to dwell on what the analysis actually said about the mechanics of it, because the mechanics are the measure of what she had done. The blind spot in the Vethani monitoring protocol was not obvious. The timing offset in the scan cycle was a consequence of how the system handled overlapping administrative traffic bursts, a corner case in the protocol's prioritization logic that produced a predictable gap of approximately 3 to 4 seconds every 47 minutes when the system was running under normal administrative load. Identifying that gap had required someone to study the administrative traffic patterns of the Vethani relay network in enough depth to understand its prioritization logic, which required access to the network, which required the kind of long-term covert presence inside Vethani infrastructure that Sen-Orath had spent 8 months building. She hadn't found the blind spot quickly. The analysis noted that the earliest Resistance signals through Meridian 4 showed a higher error rate and less precise timing than the later ones. The early cycles had been exploratory, learning the edges of the window. By cycle 200, the timing was consistent to within fractions of a second. She had gotten very good at it. And then she had written down what cycle it was at, and what it was called, and left the note. The note was informational. It was telling the next person in that corridor, this channel is still running. This is where we are in its operational history. The work continues. Not a goodbye, an update. When I read that analysis, I sat with it for a while. I thought about what it meant to write an update in a corridor you might not walk out of. Not a last message, not a final statement, not something addressed to a specific person, a status report. A note that assumed its reader would be someone who needed operational information. A note written by someone who, even in that corridor with that uncertainty, was thinking about the next person in the sequence. The Resistance confirmed her death 6 weeks after the Keshiev operation. She had been in Vethani custody for approximately 3 weeks after she wrote the note. The communication from the Resistance was brief and clinically precise in the way that Resistance communications had to be by that stage, detailed where detail was operationally necessary, minimal everywhere else. What it said was, Sen-Orath, relay technician, 3rd District Cell, confirmed non-operational from date of capture. The language was clinical because there was no operational alternative to clinical language, and because clinical language is what you use when the names have become too numerous to carry the weight of each one and still write the sentences. I read it in the same quiet room. I sat with it. Then I filed it with the Keshiev documentation and went back to work. But I kept thinking about the note, and I want to try to explain why, because I think it matters and I think I have spent enough time with it now to say something that isn't just sentiment. I was in that corridor because of a mechanism I had nothing to do with. Centuries of electromagnetic noise, generations of industrial and military and commercial signal saturation, had pushed human neural filtering into a configuration that happened to treat the Vethani compliance frequency as ambient static. I didn't earn that. I didn't choose it. I didn't resist the pulse. I didn't even experience the pulse. My nervous system encountered it and filed it in the same folder as the hum of power conduit, and the interference off a transit grid transformer, and every other signal in the background of human daily life that the body learns, over time and over generations, to discard as not requiring attention. The least heroic kind of advantage. Not strength, not will, not decision. Background noise that got classified as background a long time before I was born and stayed classified. That is the whole of what I had in that corridor, that the three people on the floor didn't have. What Sen-Orath had was different in every way that matters. She had been inside Vethani-held installations for 8 months. She had been through compliance pulse events, had been, by the nature of her work, in exactly the kind of position I found myself in at position 4 in Corridor D, where the pulse was the known variable and the question was what you did with the time before and after it. She had managed that knowledge and those risks for 8 months of operation. She had run a covert signal channel through Vethani administrative infrastructure for 211 cycles without triggering detection. She had, in some corridor at some point in those 8 months, looked at an access panel and thought, someone is going to come after me and they're going to need to know what I know, and I should write it down. She wrote it carefully. Small, clear characters, not rushed. The kind of care you take when you've decided that something is worth doing correctly and you intend to do it correctly regardless of the circumstances. 6 words and a number, an update, for a person she would never know. I've been in a dozen relay corridors since Kashirv. The compliance pulse has fired in 3 of them while I was inside. Each time the people around me go down, and I stand there in the particular silence of a room that has just reorganized itself around a single working biology, and I do the work that needs doing, and I get people to where they need to be. That is the job. It has a clean shape. Something needs doing and you do it, and the doing of it is the whole requirement. I have never found the job difficult in the practical sense of the word. The work is straightforward when you're the one still standing. I have thought sometimes about what the Vethani intended when they designed the compliance network. Not the tactical intent, that's clear and well documented, the suppression of resistance movement, the enforcement of cordon protocols, the management of populations that had stopped doing what they were told. The deeper intent, what they imagined when they built a system that could reach into a nervous system and remove the capacity to decide. I think they imagined that decision-making was the thing to remove, that if you took away the ability to choose, you took away the threat, that a being stripped of agency was a being that had been neutralized. What they didn't account for, or didn't think to account for, was the decision that had already been made. The note on the panel was not a decision being made in the moment of the pulse. It was a decision that had already been made, 4 months prior, in a different instance of this exact corridor, by a person who was not present anymore. The pulse couldn't suppress it because there was nothing there to suppress. It was already done. It existed in 6 words on the back of a panel face, in handwriting that would still be legible when both Sen-Orath and the Vethani compliance network were long past. The pulse dropped everyone in that corridor for 11 years. Every nervous system with the right architecture, every organism that shared the oscillation frequency that the Vethani had spent a great deal of careful engineering on targeting precisely. What it could not drop was a note. Each time, in each corridor since Kashirv, before I start moving, I spend a moment looking at the panels on the wall. Not because I expect to find anything. The chances of finding a grease pencil note in a given relay corridor are low, and the Vethani have become more systematic about identifying and clearing resistance markings as the war has continued. I don't find notes anymore. Most corridors are just corridors. But I look, because she looked at the panel and thought, the next person needs to know. And that thought, that specific, unsentimental, practical act of looking forward to a person who isn't there yet, seems to me to be the thing worth carrying out of that corridor and into the next one. Not the resistance heroics of it, not the sacrifice framing that gets applied to these things afterward when people are trying to make comprehensible something that was actually just a person in a corridor with a grease pencil and a decision. The discipline, the care, the choice to write the update instead of the goodbye. I asked the intelligence cell, after the analysis came back, whether the resistance would want a copy of the photograph. They forwarded it through their liaison channels. I don't know what happened to it on the other end, whether it reached anyone who had known her, whether anyone from the 3rd District cell saw it, whether it meant anything to anyone beyond its operational value as documentation of a covert channel's operating history. I wanted them to have it. I wanted someone who had known her to know that someone had read it. She was right about the channel, as it turned out. Meridian 4 ran for another 19 months after she wrote the note. The resistance used it for 463 additional cycles before the Vethani finally identified and closed the blind spot. And even then, the closure took 3 months from initial detection to full suppression, because the timing protocol she had built into the channel's operation was subtle enough that the Vethani's monitoring systems initially classified it as instrument noise rather than deliberate transmission. What she had built into the architecture of that channel, the operational insight embedded in 211 cycles of careful, disciplined use, outlasted her by a year and a half. It did more work after she wrote the note than it had done before. The person who came after her in that corridor read the note and knew what to look for and ran the channel for another 200 cycles before passing it to a 3rd operator. I don't know the name of that person. I don't know the name of the 3rd one. The resistance operates on the compartmentalization that makes survival possible, and the compartmentalization means that the names behind the operational cycles don't travel with the cycle counts. But they were in the corridor, they read the note, they kept the channel running. There was no guarantee that would happen. She had no way of knowing whether the next person in that corridor would have the context to understand what Meridian 4 referred to, or whether the note would be found by the wrong team, or found and ignored, or found and misread. She wrote it anyway. She wrote it in the full knowledge that it might mean nothing to whoever opened that panel, and with the equally full knowledge that if it did mean something to someone, it would mean everything, that the work she'd done for 8 months would have a path forward instead of a closed door. She bet on the possibility that the right person would come, and she did everything she could to make sure that if they did, they would have what they needed. Meridian 4 still active. She wasn't wrong. The compliance pulse dropped everyone in that corridor for 11 years. Every soldier, every specialist, every diplomat, every surveyor who walked through without clearance. It dropped them all, without preference, without exception, without regard for what they'd come for, or what they'd known, or how long they'd been doing this work. 11 years of a signal going out and finding exactly what it was looking for in every nervous system it touched. Mine it didn't find, or found and discarded. I am still not entirely sure which, and I'm not sure the distinction matters practically, though it interests me as a question of mechanism. Whether the frequency was never received, or received and immediately filed as noise, or something in between that the current models don't have language for yet. What it found instead in that corridor on that morning was a man holding a panel at an angle in the light from the slit windows, reading a note for the second time, understanding what the silence around him meant, and deciding what to do next. I did what I could with what I had. That's all it was. I kept the photograph. I have it still in my documentation archive in the sequence from Corridor D at Keshev Station, timestamped 074133. 2 shots, slightly different angles. The grease pencil note in the upper right corner of the back face, small careful characters, the serial plate visible in the lower left of the frame. Meridian 4 still active, 211 delta. I look at it sometimes, not often, but when I'm preparing for a corridor I haven't been in, when I'm reading a briefing about a target I'm going into without enough time, and with numbers that are close but workable, I look at it. I look at the handwriting. I think about what it costs to write carefully when you aren't sure you're going to walk out, and what it means that she did anyway, and what it means that the work she described in those 6 words kept running for 19 months after she was gone. I think about the word still, not the number, not the designation, not even the name of the channel, the word still. It's a choice, that word. You could write Meridian 4 active 211 delta and carry the same operational information. The still is something else. It's a direct address to the doubt, to the possibility that the person reading it would assume otherwise, would assume that 8 months of Vethani pressure had closed every channel, ended every operation, resolved every open question in the reach in the Vethani's favor. The still says, you might think it's over. It isn't. It says, the doubt is expected, and the answer to the doubt is here, in this word, in this corridor, written by someone who knew the doubt was coming and wrote through it anyway. I think that is the thing the compliance pulse was never going to find in any of us. Not because of neural architecture or electromagnetic filtering or anything about biology, because it was never in the biology to begin with. It was in the decision to write the note. In the understanding that the work is bigger than the person doing it and will outlast the person doing it, and that the person doing it is responsible, not required, not ordered but responsible, in the way that a craftsman is responsible for the quality of the work they leave behind, for handing it forward as clearly as they can, in whatever time they have, to the person who comes next. That is not something you can suppress. It doesn't live in the oscillation frequency. It doesn't live in the nervous system at all. It lives in the handwriting, in the care of the characters, in the choice of the word still. It lives in the grease pencil and the 60 seconds someone took in a corridor with uncertain exit to write down what they knew for the person who would come after them. Still active. Not was, not had been still.